D.C.
The homicide rate in the district continues to climb.
Drugs have permeated our entire community.
It is happening at every school. It is happening everywhere.
You could just be walking and that bullet can just hit you. Bullet don't got no name.
How is it that the United States can manage to go into Panama and get Noriega, but they can't stop the inflow of drugs into Washington, D.C.?
Tell me what drugs you dealt with in prison. Crack? Heroin?
Heroin.
What else?
Marijuana.
Nothing left. I mean, you did the gamut.
Yeah, I did it all.
Mayor Berry was arrested last night at the Vista Hotel in downtown Washington.
Back in the mid-'80s and early '90s, out-of-towners were always looking to expand their hustles, and one of the biggest targets was Washington, D.C. But there was a huge problem. D.C. was in complete chaos. At the time, it was known as the Emder capital of the U.S., and for good reason. The streets were on fire, locals were trigger-happy, and teenagers hungry for respect wouldn't think twice before pulling a gun over the smallest slight. Seeing a dead body in the street became so common that people barely reacted anymore.
They don't know what will happen next when we find a body laying in the alley. Maybe wake up one morning, there'd be one on your front porch.
Residents were afraid to step outside because you never knew when a stray bullet could come flying your way.
Makes me scared to come to school sometimes.
Why?
Because you never know. You could just be walking and that bullet can just hit you.
Robberies, carjackings, and violent crimes were an everyday thing.
It wasn't just homicides. Incidents of carjackings were also through the roof. 8,291 in 1989. The crime reached a peak in 1992.
And the root of all this was drugs. DC had a massive drug problem, and with that came a surge in crime unlike anything the city had ever seen before.
So what was fueling this surge in crime? Drugs, mainly crack, an epidemic that gripped not just the district but nationwide. The drug trade was brazen. Open-air markets flourished with hundreds of buyers and sellers.
They didn't seem to be worried about police or neighbors.
Here's a crazy little fact. The Washington Bullets, DC's NBA team at the time, actually changed their name because of how bad things were. The team owner felt like Bullets was just too connected to the city's out-of-control violence, so he rebranded the team to something that felt more energetic and fun. That's how they became the Washington Wizards. But behind all this madness was that there were key players, kingpins, drug lords, gang leaders, and straight-up cares who shaped this era and kept the streets in turmoil. These are the people who ran the show behind the scenes. Let's check them out. Starting off with Rayful Edmond, often referred to as the King of Coke in Washington, D.C. By the time Rayful Edmond was 24 years old, he wasn't just a hustler. He was a full-blown drug kingpin, running one of the largest coke operations DC had ever seen. With over 150 people working under him, his empire was pulling in an unbelievable $300 million a year.
When crack was the hustle here in the nation's capital back in the 1980s, nobody, absolutely nobody worked harder than Rayful Edmond III.
Rayful Edmond III, the biggest drug dealer in the history of Washington, D.C., sold some $300 million a year worth of and crack.
Rayful ran his business out of Northeast D.C., locking down prime drug spots, including the strip between Morton and Orleans Place and 4th Street near M Street. These weren't just random corners, these were strategic locations with built-in escape routes, perfect for his crew to vanish if the police got too close. His grandmother's house on M Street became the nerve center of his operation, where raw coke was cooked into crack, packaged, and prepped for the streets. With demand skyrocketing, he needed manpower. Rayful's crew expanded fast, enforcers armed to the teeth, sellers pushing product around the clock, and young lookouts paid to keep an eye on police activity. Even his own family was involved. Business was booming, and so was the addiction crisis. At its peak, his operation was moving nearly 1,700 kilos of Colombian coke every month, a pipeline that ran straight from LA to the streets of DC. On a busy night, Rayful's crew was making 30 sales per minute. That's $750K in a week and $2 million a month. But big money brings big problems. And with Rayful's success came violence. His crew was linked to at least 30 Emders, all in the name of protecting territory and keeping power.
Police say the Edmond organization enforced its will with violence. As many as 30 murders.
Then, on April 15, 1989, everything came crashing down. Rayful was arrested at his girlfriend's house in D.C. His downfall started when 4 of his men were busted in L.A., trying to buy $1 million worth of coke from an undercover federal agent. Once they got caught, they started talking, and the feds quickly realized they weren't dealing with just any street-level operation. They had just cracked open the empire. Rayful's trial was like something out of a movie. Over 100 witnesses testified against him. It was also the first ever anonymous jury in DC history because of how dangerous the case was. Bulletproof glass had to be installed in the courtroom to protect jurors from potential attacks.
Jurors are under 24-hour guard. Their names are kept secret. The whole trial is conducted behind bulletproof glass.
A 17-year-old witness, Donald P. Wimley, was murdered in a drive-by shooting just days before he was supposed to testify. Another witness's home was firebombed just to send a message.
In fact, the house of the family of one witness was firebombed after her testimony. Another key witness has refused to testify.
The government wasn't taking any chances. Rayful was held at Quantico Marine Base in Virginia for his own safety and flown into court by helicopter every day. But when he saw the overwhelming evidence stacking up against him, he made a desperate move. He snitched. Reports say Rayful's cooperation helped take down over 100 people. Some even claim it was closer to 300. The news destroyed his reputation. For a man who once ruled the streets, he was now seen as the ultimate traitor.
Rayful Edmond have the biggest cooperation I've ever seen in history.
What do you mean?
He told on over 300 people.
300 people? After Rayful cooperated, your son went to go see you. And I guess he was around 16 years old at the time. And you guys actually talked about the whole Rayful cooperating situation.
With somebody that he, really, looked at as, as a family member, you know what I'm saying? And it really affected him what he did.
After 5 days of jury deliberation, the verdict was in. Guilty on all counts. Rayful was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving 2 concurrent life sentences. But here's where it gets crazy. Even behind bars, Rayful somehow kept his hustle going. Word on the street was that he made more money locked up than he did when he was free. His influence stretched far beyond the prison walls, proving that his connections ran deep.
Tell me what drugs you dealt with in prison. Crack? Heroin?
Heroin.
What else?
Marijuana.
Fast forward to recent years and Rayful's story took another shocking turn. After decades in prison, he was quietly released. Those who saw him said he seemed in good spirits, ready to leave his past behind. But just a few months later, news broke that Rayful had suffered a fatal heart attack. Next up is Kevin Gray. When people talk about ruthless DC kingpins, Rayful Edmond's name always comes up. But Kevin Gray was on a whole different level. Law enforcement described him as vicious as John Gotti, more ruthless than Rayful Edmond, and as violent as Al Capone. His reputation was built on brutality and fear. Kevin was the nephew of Linwood Big Boy Gray, an alleged H-kingpin with deep ties in the game. Not much is known about Kevin's early life, but by the time he was 14, he was already in the streets learning the game. But unlike most hustlers who stuck to drugs and money, Kevin took things to a whole new level. Besides moving massive amounts of coke, H, and marijuana, Kevin was also deeply involved in MDR. A lot of MDR. When he was finally taken down, the charges were beyond insane. Kevin personally pulled the trigger in 5 MDRs. He ordered hits on at least 10 more. His crew was charged in 31 homicides. He eliminated witnesses before they could testify. He offed rivals and the rivals of his rivals. By the time the feds built their case against him, Kevin and his organization were one of the most feared groups in DC. His empire stretched from Capitol Hill to Congress Heights, with tight control over the drug trade and brutal enforcement tactics. When it was all said and done, Kevin Gray was facing a mountain of charges: racketeering, conspiracy, drug-to-trafficking, and multiple MDR counts. And it looks like he's holding up well behind bars. His former cellmate, Steve Crawford, mentioned that he's staying vibrant and full of faith.
You know, and man, he's stronger than ever, man. He's vibrant than ever, and he's full of faith. So, yeah, he was pretty cool. He was fun. He's super funny. Got all the stories in the world.
Next up is Alpo Martinez. By the 1980s in New York City, drug dealers weren't just making money. They were the superstars of the streets. Forget rappers or athletes. If you had money, power, and respect, you ran the game. And when it came to running the game, Alpo Martinez was one of the top dogs. Alpo wasn't just making moves in Harlem, he was expanding his empire, setting up shop in places like Washington, D.C., where the drug trade was booming, and Alpo was living flashy. He wasn't just about making money, he wanted everyone to know he had it.
Alpo liked good things, nice things, but wow, get a motorcycle, buy a brand new bike where the crowd is at, do wheelies, crash it, and the next day go buy another motorcycle.
But in the streets, loyalty is everything, and one act of betrayal would change everything for him. On January 3rd, 1990, Alpo did something that sent shockwaves through the game. He offed his own man, Rich Porter. Rich Porter was Alpo's right-hand man, a legend in Harlem, and one of the most respected hustlers around. So what happened? Alpo started believing Rich was lying to him. He thought Rich was holding out on a drug connection, keeping the good product for himself while Alpo was getting leftovers. It didn't matter that they'd made millions together, or that Rich had always been solid. In Alpo's mind, Rich crossed the line. That night, Alpo set up a meeting. Rich got into the van. Alpo locked the doors. As I was pulling off, I was asking him, "Yo, Rich, where did you get that coke from?" "That ish was good," Alpo later recounted, "because I wanted to make him comfortable." Then he shot him.
I was asking him like, "Yo, Rich, where did you get that coke from, man? That shit good," because I wanted to make him comfortable. "That shit good as a." He's like, "I got it from my connect." From there, I knew he was lying. I turned to my little man. I gave him the nod. Once I gave him the nod, my little man spent, because he was short, so he could stand up in the van. Next thing you heard was the 2 gunshots, bang, bang.
I was very mad, Alpo admitted years later. I just offed a dude that I loved, a dude I called my brother. But that was just the beginning. Exactly how many people Alpo offed, that number will probably never be known. By 1991, Alpo's luck ran out. November 7th, 1991. Most people remember that as the day Magic Johnson announced he had HIV. But in DC, that was the day Alpo Martinez got taken down. The FBI had been hunting him for a year. When they finally caught him in Southeast DC, Alpo was looking at 14 EMDR charges, including the K-ing of Rich Porter and Rich's 12-year-old little brother William. Death row was a real possibility. Alpo had a choice: sit in prison for life or snitch. He snitched. In exchange for cooperating with the feds, Alpo's sentence got cut down drastically. Instead of death row, he did a little over 2 decades and was released in 2015. But the streets never forget. Alpo was back on the scene and moving around Harlem. But on October 31st, 2021, he was gunned down in Harlem, shot multiple times in his Dodge Ram truck. No one was shocked. Everyone knew it was coming. Next up is Wayne Silk Perry. Silk wasn't just a shooter. He wasn't just a killer. Silk was the K-er. They called him the Michael Jordan of the EMDR game. Not just because of his numbers, but because of how effortlessly he did it.
This guy, Wayne Perry, was considered the Michael Jordan of the game.
Wayne Perry was one of our most prolific in D.C.
His nickname Silk came from his smoothness in sports. As a kid, he was so good at basketball that it seemed like he could go pro. But the streets called louder. Crime was easier, and crime paid now. By the time he was 12, Silk was already deep in the game. He started as a lookout, signaling when the police came. In return, the older hustlers taught him everything: how to gamble, rob, steal, hustle. By 13, he was fully in the streets. By 16, he robbed his first bank, and he liked it. Silk had a taste for violence. Once, someone joked about taking his chain. Silk offed him. In 1984, he caught his first EMDR charge. He went to prison, got out in 1987, and instead of slowing down, he leveled up. He became a full-time hitman. No drive-bys, no sloppy work. Silk walked up on his targets, put the gun to their head, and handled business. His reputation became so terrifying that no one dared to testify against him. Witnesses knew if they snitched, they wouldn't make it to court. But Silk wasn't just a lone wolf. He had a crew. A team of stone-cold K-ears who followed his orders without hesitation. Then he linked up with Alpo Martinez. Alpo was getting money. Silk was making bodies drop. Together they were unstoppable. Alpo made sure Silk and his crew were well taken care of. Cars, cash, Versace clothes, luxury living. Silk was riding around in a Mercedes-Benz 560, living like a king. Everything was going perfect, until it wasn't. When Alpo got arrested and started snitching, he didn't just give up random names, he gave up Silk. With Alpo's testimony, Silk was done. The government hit him with everything, 5 life sentences. Next up is Garrett Terrell. By the 1980s, Washington D.C. quote, S streets were full of hustlers trying to make a name for themselves, and Garrett Big Head Gary Terrell was one of them. Like most kids in the game, Gary started off robbing people. That was his entry point, sticking people up, getting fast money, and making a reputation. But robbing could only get you so far. The real money was in drugs, and Gary knew that. Once he got into the drug trade, he started moving different. He wasn't out there hustling on street corners, he was thinking bigger. His thing was moving weight between New York and DC, but he wasn't running it in beat-up cars or taking dumb risks. He moved smart. Gary had a system. He rented limos to transport bricks. While the feds and stick-up boys were looking for beat-up Hondas and Cadillacs, Gary's product was riding in luxury. And the plan worked, and he stacked his bread up fast. After a while, Gary was sitting on millions. That meant he started running in different circles. That's how he got close to Alpo Martinez and Wayne Silk Perry. Now, Gary was making major moves, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. See, Alpo was the boss, and Gary didn't like that. He didn't like how Alpo was calling all the shots. He felt like he wasn't getting the credit he deserved. In his mind, he had put in the work, but people were acting like he was just another player in Alpo's game. Gary had what you call a Napoleon complex. He was a little dude, about 5'2", but if you underestimated him, he'd send you to your grave real quick.
He was about 5'1", 5'2", real slim in the body, and a real big head. Okay. But he was getting money, though. People didn't know he was getting money. He had a real short man complex. Okay.
When you dealt with Gary, you had to handle him with care. Say the wrong thing, he'd take it personal. Look at him the wrong way. That might be your last day on Earth. He had a short fuse, and when he got mad, the first thing he reached for was his gun. But for all his money and power, Gary had regular problems too, like relationship drama. He had a main girl, the mother of his child. But of course, he had side chicks too, and he got caught up with them more than a few times. Now, his main chick didn't just sit back and take it. She wanted her lick back. So what did she do? She started messing with somebody close to their circle, Andre Johnson. Andre wasn't some random dude. Gary did business with him. That made it disrespectful. And worse, she didn't keep it quiet. She let it be known. Now, stepping out is one thing, but doing it with someone you know, that's straight up disrespect. Gary wasn't having it, but he wasn't even mad at her like that. The real problem was Andre. Andre knew that was Gary's girl, and in Gary's mind, that was a violation. Now, Alpo tried to play peacemaker. Alpo didn't want beef messing up his money, and Andre was spending $400,000 a month with him. Plus, Alpo wasn't sweating it because he was hitting Andre's girl too. Basically, everybody was smashing everybody's girl, and Andre knew about it, but he kept it cool, so to keep the peace, Andre backed off. He stopped messing with Gary's girl, and that should have been the end of it. But the problem was, she was in love, and she started lying. She started telling Gary they were still messing around. Now, whether Andre really was still messing with her is debatable. If he was bold as hell to keep doing business with Alpo while Gary was around. But either way, Gary believed it. So one day, Andre met up with Alpo, and he never made it back. That was Andre's last day. After that, Gary fell back from Alpo. The trust was broken. They threw each other under the bus, and their partnership started falling apart. And then, it got even worse. Gary and Alpo started working on a major drug deal. We're talking 100 kilos of coke, and the total price was $6 million. Alpo was putting in $1.5 million. Gary was putting in $500,000. The other $4 million would be paid after they flipped the bricks. But Gary had other plans. He wasn't looking to split the money. He was looking to take it all. Gary planned to off Alpo and walk off with his $1.5 million and all the coke. That was easy money, but the only problem was that Silk found out about the setup.
A man called me down from law and he said, Gary told him that, that you want to put this deal together and it ain't gonna go, he gonna wind up doing you in the process. Just how much anger he built up from me.
And Silk wasn't about to let that slide. When the moment came, Silk handled it. He put 2 bullets in Gary's head and dumped his naked body in Rock Creek Park.
So he hit him in the head twice. Down. Gary, he winds up on himself. From his muscles. I said, take off his clothes, man. For they won't spot him through the clothes and all that. Take off his clothes and leave in the wood.
That was the end of Big Head Gary. Next up is Marion Barry. While the streets were dealing with Kayers and kingpins, Washington, D.C.'s mayor, Marion Barry, was going through his own kind of scandal. By the time he was on his third term, everybody knew he was struggling with coke and alcohol addiction. And this wasn't just any era. Crack had exploded across the country. By late 1989, federal officials were already investigating Barry for illegal drug possession. Then, on January 18, 1990, the FBI and D.C. police set him up. They ran a sting operation at the Vista International Hotel. Barry was with his ex-girlfriend, Hazel Diane Rashida Moore. But what Barry didn't know was that she was an FBI informant. She invited him over, but there was a catch. Before they got intimate, she insisted he smoke freebase coke. Barry hesitated, but eventually he hit the pipe, and the FBI agents were watching the whole thing on camera. So the second he took a hit, they ran in and arrested him.
Mayor Barry was arrested last night at the Vista Hotel in downtown Washington.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like you to put your hands on the wall. Please put your hands on the wall.
Barry ended up facing 3 felony counts of perjury, 10 counts of drug possession, and 1 misdemeanor conspiracy charge. But the trial was a mess. The jury was split. Some thought Barry was clearly guilty, but others believed the whole case was a setup. The judge eventually declared a mistrial. The scandal forced Barry to step down as mayor in 1990. But in a crazy turn of events, after everything, Barry came back and was elected mayor one more time.